All right, the second part is ethics of sex. And again, we're going to start with two novels and then get into a textbook. The first novel is Stranger in a Strange Land. It's by an incredibly famous and influential science fiction writer, Robert Heinlein. Came out in the early 60s. The free love thing happened a few years later. That wasn't a complete coincidence, because he actually, that novel played a role in a lot of people deciding that they really wanted to, make love not war and have a whole bunch of love-ins and stuff like that. It's about a guy who was raised by Martians. He was born in the first Martian colony or something, and the rest of the colony all died, and the Martians saved him. So he was an infant when he fell completely out of the influence of human beings and completely into the influence of Martians, which is kind of like being raised by wolves if wolves were utterly and absolutely alien and yet had concepts, thought, long-term planning, and things like that. So he is eventually returned to Earth, and he doesn't really get along very well with people. He doesn't really understand them. They don't really understand him. But he sees a kind of a mystical significance in sex and free loving and stuff. It's thoroughly anti-puritanical. He sets up a weird sex cult. Anyway, it's a really interesting novel. A lot of people have read it, and it's made a lot of difference in a lot of people's lives. And other people completely hate it and think that Robert Heinlein is advocating sheer evil. But we're going to read that. We'll see what you think. The next novel is Lady Chatterley's Lover, written in the late 20s by D.H. Lawrence. Unlike the other novels that I'm assigning you for this class, this isn't one that I had ever read before. I actually haven't finished it now as I'm doing this. Hopefully I'll have finished it by Tuesday when class starts. It is a little bit less enjoyable to read than the other novels, but if you'll really actually pay some attention to what's going on, there are some really interesting insights, right? It's about an English woman whose husband is injured in the First World War. He comes home paralyzed and impotent. And so it's sort of this conflict in Lady Chatterley between an arid life of the mind, or a sort of a grungy life of material mechanical existence, and having a passionate romance with the groundskeeper. So it's basically about this woman who has an affair, which in a way is kind of banal, but on the other hand, if you're the one having the affair, it isn't banal to you. So it's about kind of how she and how the people around herself experience their sexuality in their bodies, but also their relationship to life in general, with sexuality just being sort of the high point, or the emphasis of the novel in particular. So if you will read it really thoughtfully, there will be these really detailed little passages where or I should say where the narrator is talking about how she experiences sex. And they're interesting. They're worth thinking about. And then the textbook for that part is, no surprise here, it's the Philosophy of Sex textbook. An actual discipline, there are jobs in philosophy of sex. We're going to read the whole textbook. The first part of it is on conceptual issues. Basically, we kind of want to figure out what sex is, which you'd think would be totally obvious. But on the other hand, you think that someone's cheating on you if they're sleeping with someone else. But what if it's cybersex? Are they cheating on you? Seems that way. Does that make it sex? I don't know. That could be. It's an interesting thought to have, right? So in general, when are you having sex? How many other people do there have to be? None? Can they be miles away? Weird. You'd think it's obvious, but turns out maybe it isn't so obvious. The second part is mainly about homosexuality, which you're going to get lots of in Stranger in a Strange Land anyway. There's also going to be a little bit in there about polyamory, which is having an honest, open relationship with more than one person at the same time. And then the next two parts of it are mainly about issues of consent, right? Who can you sleep with, and under what circumstances, and what should you be doing with them? And it's about other kinds of sexual use, right? In, say, pornography, we sexually use another person, right? It's a kind of sexual consumption of the performers. Is that okay, or is that abusive? Is it mean? Is it degrading? And then people have had both sets of thoughts, and we're going to look at both of them. And then in prostitution, again, obviously this is a sexual use of someone, but is it a consumption that degrades them, or is it just another job like any other? And you'd think, now wait a minute, last video you said you were going to try to focus on issues that would make a difference in our day-to-day lives. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time hanging around with prostitutes, so what are you talking about? The fact, though, is that a lot of people trade a lot of sex for a lot of things. Right? A lot of people will trade sex for not having to fight with their husbands. Some people will trade sex for babies. Some people will trade sex for not having to put up with whining about how she doesn't have a baby. We do, in fact, trade sex. Not always for money, but for other things. Some of those times we think that's okay, and some of those times we think there's something kind of creepy or degrading about it. And so we're going to think about that, right? I mean, if you're trading sex for a marriage, is that okay? Is that kind of your call? Is it degrading? What is it? So we're going to try to think about that kind of thing. Last section is philosophy of technology, and here I think science fiction novels are the obvious way to go. So we're going to start out with two of those. The first one is called Schismatrix, and there are a group of short stories that are closely associated in the volume that I had you get. So it's called Schismatrix Plus. It's the novel plus these short stories. It's written by an Austin-based science fiction writer named Bruce Sterling in the late 80s. It's what's called cyberpunk, although it's kind of set farther off in the future than most cyberpunk is. It is about a milieu in which people live in the rest of the solar system, and they're kind of roughly divided into two ways of life. One way of life is the way of life of people who are highly genetically re-engineered. So these are called shapers. They're the genetically reshaped. And the other are people who are highly mechanically altered, right? They've been cyborged. They have parts of their bodies replaced by machinery. And so they have bodies that are partly machines. And they have a number of kind of spiritual, cultural, political, economic, financial, military clashes. And the novel follows you through a guy who I think is a shaper. He has a number of experiences across a couple of hundred years in this milieu. And it's about the way that technology changes us. Right? I mean, these are people who are literally partly not biologically human. And we think, we have this concern, well, that would completely destroy any sense of spirituality or humanity, and it doesn't. Right? It makes it very strange. It's weird. The things that these people do in this novel, they're weird, but they're not unrecognizable. They're not inhuman, even though these people are half machine. The other novel is called The Player of Games by Ian Banks. Banks is a Scottish science fiction writer, and that novel came out in, I think, the middle 80s, something like that. It's more of a technological, straightforward utopia. It's about a milieu called the culture, which is a society of people who have an awful lot of metabolic self-control. So they can, if they're feeling in a bad mood, they can just excrete Zoloft into themselves with a Zoloft excretion hormone generator in their regular glands, right? It's like when you or I would have the fight or flight hormone, whatever it's called, I'm totally blanking. Something scary happens and you just have adrenaline, that's the one. You just got a bunch of adrenaline. Well, they feel like they're in a bad mood and they say, you know what, I would like to feel drunk. And they can exude alcohol into themselves. Or they say, I'd like to hallucinate now, poof, LSD in the brain. They don't, do that all the time, but they can. They can also change sex at will if they just think about it for a few months. But the culture has, most of its residents live in gigantic spaceships. And all of the work is done by artificial intelligences and the spaceships. They have culture minds, which are artificial intelligences of spectacular power, and then their spaceships are themselves self-conscious. And so all the work is done by machine. And you'd think, well, that's going to completely destroy their sense of human values, right? They're just going to lay around glanding heroin into themselves and nothing's going to happen. But that isn't true. They live a leisure-based life, but it's one that they find serious value in. And they also have morality, which they sometimes want to impose on other civilizations, right? And this novel in particular is about a case in which they want to impose their morality on another civilization. So in one way, we can identify with the culture because the other civilization looks kind of crude, kind of barbaric. They're overtly violent, stuff like that. So we think, I don't like, let's go with Muammar Gaddafi. You know what? Let's get rid of him. And we can do that, right? We have that as a power now. So in that sense, we can identify with the culture as the overwhelmingly dominant civilization around. On the other hand, our society actually kind of looks like the people that the culture wants to change, right? So it's about, these different societies and how they relate to their different technologies and what that means in terms of values and styles of life and things like that. So that's going to get us reflecting on what the effects of technology are on us. And then we're going to close out with a set of readings from a philosophy of technology book called Technology and Values. I think it's actually edited by a guy here at Texas State. That's in the course packet. And that's going to, I haven't read most of that stuff in a lot of detail in a long time, so I'm not going to give you too much of a heads up on that, but that's going to be toward the end of the semester. So that's kind of a brief survey of what all the books are going to be, and I hope that you enjoy them. I actually enjoyed reading these books when I read them. I enjoyed The Fountainhead when I read it when I was 15. The Remains of the Day was more recent, but I loved it. It's one of my favorite novels, and Ishiguro is now one of my favorite novelists. Schismatrix Plus and Player of Games are just fun to read, period. Stranger in a Strange Land, everybody always loves. Lady Chatterley's Lover is going to take a little bit more work to get through, but I promise that there are some rewards. And the rest of the stuff is actually, most of it's pretty lively, kind of interesting. You know, it's a little bit drier, more academic, but I think it's okay. So I'll be back in later with a little bit of introduction to what ethics is. Have a good day.